The year is 1064 in the burning deserts of Jerusalem. A story that defies all logic is about to be written in blood. 800 hardened men from the north, Viking warriors tested in 1,000 battles, are about to face an army 40 times their size. What happened that day would forever change the way military power was understood in the Holy Land, proving that sometimes faith itself can be the deadliest weapon of all. But before I reveal the most chilling details of this massacre, I need you to do something for me. If this story already has you hooked, the same way it had me when I first discovered it, show it by hitting that like button right now. Because I promise you, what comes next will shatter every expectation you have about what religious fanaticism can achieve on the battlefield. Our story begins not under the desert sun, but on the misty shores of Norway. There ruled King Magnus III, better known as Magnus Barefoot, named for his habit of wearing traditional Scottish garments instead of the typical royal attire. By his time, Christianity had reached Scandinavia, but it hadn't extinguished the Viking spirit. Instead, it fused with it, creating something far more dangerous: holy warriors. Magnus heard the calls of Pope Alexander II, urging the faithful to defend the sacred places of Christianity. But unlike other European nobles who saw the Crusades as political opportunities, Magnus saw something different. He saw the chance to merge Viking ferocity with divine justification. His warriors would not march to the Holy Land as mere conquerors. They would go as the very instruments of God's will. The recruitment was brutal and selective. Magnus didn't want ordinary soldiers. He wanted the best of the best, the veterans of endless wars between the Nordic kingdoms, men who had proven themselves not once, but dozens of times. Each of the 800 chosen had to demonstrate 3 things: mastery with axe and sword, inhuman endurance, and most importantly, an unshakable faith in their divine mission. For months, these warriors endured training that combined ancient Viking combat techniques with new tactics borrowed from Byzantine mercenaries. They learned to fight as one cohesive unit, something Vikings traditionally did not do. They drilled defensive formations, practiced coordinated strikes, and, most critically, trained to hold their discipline under extreme pressure. But the physical training was only half of it. Magnus also brought in monks, warrior priests, and military chaplains to shape the spiritual side of his men. Every day began and ended with prayer. Every meal was blessed. Every weapon was consecrated. These were no longer simply soldiers. They were becoming religious fanatics with the destructive power of berserkers. In the spring of 1064, the Viking fleet set sail from Bergen. But Magnus had no intention of heading straight to the Holy Land. His plan was to build strength and experience along the way. Their first stop was the Orkney Islands, where he recruited local mercenaries used to fighting in warmer climates. From there, they sailed south to the coasts of Spain, where they clashed in several skirmishes against Muslim forces. Each fight was a lesson. The Vikings quickly learned that their new enemies were nothing like the Saxons or Danes they had fought back home. The Saracens were skilled horsemen, deadly archers, and masters of battlefield tactics. But the Vikings also discovered something crucial. Their enemies were unprepared for the kind of desperate, fanatical ferocity that came from blending Viking warrior tradition with religious zeal. By winter, the fleet reached Constantinople, where they forged alliances with the Byzantine Empire and acquired upgraded weapons and armor. When spring came, the expedition finally turned toward Jerusalem. By now, word of their presence had spread across the Muslim world. And yet, Saracen commanders weren't worried. After all, What were 800 men compared to the vast armies that guarded the Holy Land? Emir Abu Nasr, Shams al-Muluk, the commander of Muslim forces in the Jerusalem region, saw the Vikings' arrival as the perfect opportunity to prove his might and discourage future Christian incursions. He gathered a massive army of 40,000 men, heavy cavalry, mounted archers, specialized infantry, even siege engines. To him, this wouldn't be a battle. It would be an annihilation. The armies finally met on the arid plains southeast of Jerusalem, near the ancient fortress of Herodion. The contrast was staggering. On one side stretched endless columns of the Saracen army, banners snapping in the desert wind, the thunder of thousands of hooves and marching feet creating a constant roar. On the other, a single compact square of 800 Vikings, shields shining in the ruthless Middle Eastern sun, axes poised, silent but unyielding. Abu Nasr's strategy was simple, one he had used many times before. His cavalry would surround the Vikings completely. Archers would rain down arrows to weaken them, and then his infantry would strike the final blow. Against countless armies, this tactic had been foolproof. He had no reason to think today would be any different. But Magnus and his commanders had anticipated this exact strategy. In their long months of preparation, they had studied Saracen tactics carefully, and they had crafted a response that used Viking strengths and exploited Muslim weaknesses. What Abu Nasr did not know was that these 800 men weren't planning to survive. They were planning to die as martyrs in the most lethal way imaginable. At dawn, the desert trembled with the blare of Saracen war horns. The Muslim cavalry charged, thousands of riders thundering forward, scimitars flashing in the morning light. But instead of holding their ground, the Vikings did something utterly unexpected. They split apart. Now you might be wondering, how could 800 men even dream of defeating 40,000? The answer lies not in brute strength, but in the psychology of war, something the Vikings understood better than anyone else of their age. Terror can be more powerful than numbers. But before I reveal the exact moment this battle turned forever, I need your help spreading this unbelievable story. Share this video now, because what comes next will defy everything you thought you knew about medieval warfare. The 800 Vikings divided into 8 groups of 100 men each. This wasn't a retreat, nor a desperate defense. It was the execution of a tactic they had perfected in months of training: the Wheel of Death. Each group formed its own defensive circle, positioned strategically to create deadly killing zones between them. When the Saracen cavalry charged, expecting to crash through a traditional line of defense, they instead found themselves riding into a nightmare. The Viking circles allowed riders to pass between them, only to close ranks behind, trapping the cavalry in confined spaces. Suddenly, the horsemen were split apart, confused, and struck from all sides at once. The first wave of riders to fall into this trap experienced something no warrior of the Middle East had ever seen. The Vikings fought not just with terrifying ferocity, but with flawless coordination. Every strike was supported by another. Every block created a counterattack. Their movements seemed almost telepathic. But what truly horrified the Saracens wasn't the Vikings' skill. It was their complete immunity to fear and pain. These men had entered what their ancestors called the Berserker Gang, battle frenzy. But now it was supercharged by religious fanaticism. They weren't just warriors in a trance. They were believers who knew that every enemy slain guaranteed their place in paradise. Abu Nasr, watching from a high vantage point, wasn't alarmed at first. Perhaps 1,000 men lost in the opening clash, insignificant compared to the size of his army. He quickly ordered a second assault, this time using mounted archers to keep distance and rain arrows upon the Vikings. But the Norsemen had prepared for this too. During the night, each group had built temporary fortifications, using the shields of fallen foes and whatever materials they could find. When the storm of arrows fell, they huddled behind these makeshift walls, waiting patiently for the moment to strike back. What came next? Muslim chroniclers of the time would later describe as a glimpse of hell on earth. The Vikings did not simply defend. They counterattacked with weapons their enemies had never seen before. War axes forged to rip through armor, spears tipped with hooks, perfect for dragging riders off their horses from yards away. And most terrifying of all, a flammable substance acquired during their stay in Constantinople, similar to the Byzantine Greek fire. The second Saracen attack collapsed into a slaughter. Mounted archers, used to enemies breaking under their numerical superiority, suddenly found themselves facing men who did not surrender, who seemed to grow stronger with every comrade that fell. When a Viking was mortally wounded, he didn't retreat or beg for mercy. He used his last breath to kill as many enemies as possible. Abu Nasr began to realize this wasn't just an army. These men were fighting as though they were already dead, fighting as if death was not their fear, but their goal. Abu Nasr, shaken by the losses piling up, decided to abandon cautious strikes. If archers couldn't break them, then sheer numbers would. He would throw the full weight of his infantry against the Vikings, confident that no matter their ferocity, 800 men could never hold against 20,000 charging from every direction. By midday, under the crushing heat of the desert sun, the third phase of the battle began. Tens of thousands of Saracen infantry surged forward, encircling the Viking positions. Their plan was brutally simple: overwhelm the Northerners by sheer force, smothering them under endless waves of bodies. Against 25 men for every one Viking, even the fiercest warrior should crumble. But the Norsemen had been saving their most devastating weapon for this exact moment. During their winter in Constantinople, they hadn't only acquired superior armor and weapons, they had also learned the secrets of the Byzantine Greek fire, and even developed their own variant of this nightmarish substance. Each Viking circle had carefully guarded reserves of it, waiting for the moment their enemies came close enough. When the Saracen infantry closed within 50 meters, the order was given. Hundreds of incendiary projectiles were launched at once, arcing through the scorching sky. In seconds, rings of fire erupted around each Viking position. This wasn't ordinary flame. It clung to clothing and armor. It couldn't be doused with water. It fed on the desert winds, growing hotter and higher with each gust. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Panic ripped through the Saracen lines. Soldiers who moments before had marched with confidence now found themselves trapped in an inferno. The screams of men burning alive filled the battlefield, mingling with the clash of steel and the guttural war cries of the Norsemen. The Vikings, instead of holding their ground, seized the moment. They burst from their fortified circles, charging through the chaos with savage abandon. This was no longer warfare as the Saracens understood it. This was primal violence, elevated by religious conviction. Imagine the sight. 800 men, many already wounded, some even aflame from their own fire, sprinting across a hellish battlefield. They screamed ancient prayers in Old Norse as they hacked through terrified enemies who outnumbered them by dozens to one. It was a vision so unreal that it broke the minds of seasoned warriors. Abu Nasr, watching his army unravel, made a desperate choice. If numbers and fire couldn't win, perhaps the death of the Viking leader would. He called upon his personal guard, 2,000 of his finest warriors, veterans of countless battles, men feared across the region. If anyone could turn the tide, it was them. Their task was simple: cut down Magnus himself and shatter the Vikings' will. This guard was legendary. They had faced Crusaders, Byzantines, Seljuks, and many others, never once tasting defeat. But when they clashed with Magnus and his hand-picked elite, they realized they were up against something beyond their comprehension. Magnus himself was a towering figure, over 2 meters tall, wielding a massive double-headed axe said to have been blessed by the Pope. On the battlefield, he was more than a man. He was a symbol. His mere presence drove his warriors into frenzy and struck terror into his foes. What followed was a battle within the battle. The finest warriors of both worlds collided in a storm of steel and blood. For a full hour, the outcome hung in the balance. The Saracen Guard fought with the desperation of men who knew their army's survival depended on them. The Vikings fought with the certainty that God himself had ordained their victory. It was the ultimate clash of two completely different visions of war. At last, Magnus and Abu Nasr found themselves locked in single combat. Abu Nasr was no ordinary commander. He had trained in Damascus's finest schools of swordsmanship and had fought in dozens of duels. His skill was undeniable. But Magnus was something else entirely, a fusion of Viking brutality and European martial training. Driven by a conviction that every swing of his axe was guided by divine will. The duel lasted only minutes. Abu Nasr fought valiantly, but conviction outlasted skill. When Magnus's axe finally struck its mark, it wasn't just the fall of a commander. It was the psychological collapse of an entire army. From the moment their leader's body hit the ground, something broke inside the Saracen host. Soldiers who had begun the day with unshakable confidence now stared in disbelief. Could these 800 northern fanatics truly be unstoppable? The thought spread like wildfire, and with it came terror. But the story takes an even darker turn here. You might think the fall of Abu Nasr marked the climax. You'd be wrong. What followed defied every shred of logic in medieval warfare. With their commander slain and their best warriors decimated, the Saracen army should have retreated or surrendered. That would have been the rational move. But mass psychology rarely follows logic. Instead, panic detonated through the ranks. 40,000 men transformed into a stampede of chaos. Soldiers trampled their own comrades in a desperate scramble to flee these northern demons who fought as if death were their victory. Officers who tried to rally their men were ignored or cut down by their own panicked troops. Magnus, seeing the enemy in full retreat, gave a chilling order: no survivors. This wasn't a tactical decision. It was extermination, justified by the belief that God himself had handed them this victory to cleanse the Holy Land of unbelievers. The result was not just a rout, but a 3-day hunt. Across the desert, the Vikings pursued the fleeing Saracens, using every scrap of knowledge they had gathered in their long months of preparation. They cut off escape routes, set ambushes, and cornered groups of fugitives. But this wasn't simply military strategy anymore. It had become ritual. Every captured enemy was executed with prayers recited over his body. To the Vikings, this wasn't vengeance or cruelty. It was holy work, God's will carried out with axe and sword. On the first day of pursuit, 10,000 Saracens were slaughtered. On the second, 15,000 more. By the third day, only a few scattered survivors remained. The Vikings, satisfied that their divine purpose had been fulfilled, finally halted the chase. When the dust settled, the massacre had claimed over 35,000 Saracen lives. Of the 800 Vikings who had marched into the desert, only 230 had fallen. A staggering loss, yes, but nothing compared to the impossible odds they had faced. And yet, the consequences of this battle extended far beyond the battlefield. Word of the Viking victory spread across the Muslim world like wildfire. The idea that a tiny Christian force had annihilated one of the region's strongest armies was incomprehensible. Fear gripped Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. For the first time in decades, Muslim leaders began to consider the terrifying possibility that the Christians might actually retake Jerusalem. Magnus and his surviving warriors wasted no time in exploiting their newfound reputation. They rallied local Christian allies who had suffered under Muslim rule for generations. Within weeks, their force swelled to more than 3,000 men, all fanatically devoted to the holy reconquest. What followed was not a campaign of traditional conquest, but one of terror. Every victory, no matter how small, was magnified into legend. Propaganda painted the Vikings as supernatural warriors sent by God. Cities surrendered without a fight at the mere rumor of their approach. Seasoned Saracen commanders, veterans of countless campaigns, refused to face them. Magnus's reputation had become a weapon more devastating than any sword or fire. But this story doesn't end here. Because the true impact of what happened in those deserts wouldn't be revealed until decades later, when the flames of the Crusades ignited across all of Europe. The massacre at Jerusalem became more than just a bloody victory. It became legend. The brutality, the impossible odds, the sheer terror of 800 men destroying 40,000, it all spread far beyond the Holy Land. When news reached Europe, it arrived at the perfect moment. Pope Urban II was preparing his call for the First Crusade. The tale of Magnus Barefoot and his warriors became the ultimate proof that God favored Christian arms. If a tiny band of Norse fanatics could shatter a Saracen host, imagine what the united armies of Christendom could achieve. Chroniclers exaggerated the story until it resembled myth. They claimed angels fought beside the Vikings, that their weapons had been touched by miracles, that no arrow could pierce their consecrated armor. Whether people believed every detail or not didn't matter. The psychological impact was immense. Thousands of nobles and knights, hearing of this northern miracle, were convinced that divine victory was guaranteed if they took the cross. But the influence of Magnus's slaughter carried darker consequences too. His campaign set a precedent, a justification for absolute brutality in the name of religion. The idea that holy war allowed the total annihilation of the enemy became an accepted principle for crusaders. The methods pioneered by the Vikings, the use of terror, incendiary weapons, ritual executions, and relentless pursuit, were copied again and again by later Christian armies. What began as a unique expedition became a model for centuries of holy war. Magnus himself did not live to see the long shadow of his actions. He died in 1069, cut down in battle against Turkish forces near Antioch. Yet even in death, his legend only grew. Epic songs were sung of his deeds. Churches were built in his honor. His name was invoked by warriors who wanted courage, as if calling on him could bring divine favor. The few Vikings who survived and returned to Scandinavia were celebrated as heroes. Their stories of Jerusalem lit a fire in the hearts of a new generation. Many of those young men would later march east, joining the Crusades under the banner of Christ. This model, small, elite bands of religious fanatics defeating vastly larger armies, was replicated countless times in the years to come. Orders like the Templars and Hospitallers carried on the spirit of Magnus's warriors, combining faith with military discipline. But perhaps the most striking lesson of the massacre is what it reveals about the nature of conviction. These 800 men did not triumph because of superior numbers, nor solely because of better weapons or tactics. Though those played a role, they triumphed because they believed, with every fiber of their being, that they were chosen by God. That belief transformed them. They fought without fear because they saw death in battle as a guaranteed path to paradise. They endured unbearable heat, wounds, and fatigue because each struggle was a holy trial. They unleashed a ferocity that ordinary soldiers could never match because they were convinced they were instruments of divine will. The massacre of Jerusalem also exposed something fundamental about medieval war. Numbers alone did not decide battles. Morale, faith, and psychological dominance often outweighed raw size. A small, unified, fanatically dedicated force could topple a giant army if it shattered their spirit. Commanders across Christendom took note. In the decades after, many attempted to replicate the Viking model, creating elite, faith-driven units. Some succeeded spectacularly. Others failed just as dramatically. But the lesson endured. A soldier's belief could be more dangerous than his sword. Propaganda played its part as well. Once the Vikings had earned their reputation for invincibility, that reputation became a weapon in itself. Enemies surrendered before fighting. Allies joined eagerly. Campaigns were won not just with steel, but with stories. From today's perspective, the massacre is both awe-inspiring and horrifying. It shows the extremes of human capability when driven by absolute conviction. It also shows how easily that power can be turned toward atrocity. Because the same fanaticism that allowed 800 men to slaughter 40,000 is the same kind of fanaticism that fueled some of history's darkest crimes. The intensity of belief itself is not the issue. It is the morality of the cause that belief serves. Magnus and his men believed they were fighting for God's will. Their enemies saw them as demons unleashed upon the desert. Both perceptions contain truth. What cannot be denied is that their actions were extraordinary, an extreme demonstration of what humans can achieve, for good or for ill, when united by a cause greater than themselves. The massacre also left scars in the Muslim world. For generations, the memory of those northern fanatics haunted commanders and rulers. Even as they rebuilt their armies, the legend of the Vikings lingered like a shadow. The idea that Christians could call upon such terrifying zeal made every battle feel uncertain. Back in Europe, the story became one of triumph. It fueled the momentum that launched the First Crusade. It inspired warriors, terrified opponents, and reshaped the very rules of holy war. Magnus Barefoot had become more than a king. He had become a symbol, a reminder of what absolute faith could unleash. Even 1,000 years later, the lesson of his 800 warriors still resonates. They remind us that the limits of human possibility are not always physical, but mental. That sometimes the only barrier between victory and defeat is what people believe is possible. Think about it. How many times in your own life have you walked away from something because it seemed impossible before even trying? The Vikings of Magnus teach us that the impossible often exists only in the mind. Their story is both a warning and an inspiration. A warning of the horrors that fanaticism can unleash, and an inspiration of the sheer power of conviction when harnessed with purpose. In the end, the massacre of Jerusalem stands as one of the most extreme examples in history of what a small group of dedicated people can achieve. It fascinates us because it shows the highest and lowest of human nature at once. Courage, loyalty, sacrifice, and brutality, cruelty, destruction. It forces us to confront a question with no easy answer. Was their devotion admirable or monstrous? That is for each of us to decide. What we cannot deny is that it was extraordinary. A moment when the world learned that faith could move more than mountains. It could move armies. It could alter history. And so, as we close this tale of blood and fire, I want you to reflect on the lesson at its core. A small, committed band of believers changed the fate of thousands and shaped the destiny of nations. Their conviction made the impossible real.